Welcome back. Today we're covering 3-4, square roots and cube roots. By the end of today you should be able to solve equations involving square roots and cube roots, and this is something that you've seen before, so it should be a little bit of a review. The first thing here, whenever we're solving quadratic equations, which that's what we're moving towards, the first step is we need to isolate the variable. To isolate the variable means we need to get it to one side. Step 2, we need to either think backwards, what number squared equals the number given, or number cubed equals the number. Now thinking backwards, that just means if I have x squared, I'm thinking what number times itself is this answer. And so whenever dealing with an even index, meaning a squared or a fourth power or a sixth power, eighth power, you need to think positive and negative. Whenever dealing with an odd index, that means the sign of the value will remain the same. And step 3, once the variable is isolated, we solve by taking the square root or the cube root of both sides. So going through this, we're going to go through this example and we're going to use these steps along the way. So looking at our first example, here we have example 1. We find the value of x in each equation. So this says x squared equals 16. Now I could think of that as x times x equals 16, and I'd say, okay, what number times itself is 16? And you could come up with it that way. Or you could take the step number 3 by isolating this. We have this variable on one side. I want to get rid of this squared, so you think of the word squared, there's a math symbol we use which is called a square root. So I could take the square root of one side. If I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other. And then I would just type that in and say, okay, squared, I'm going to do square root, and I get x equals, now if I do the square root here, my answer, notice the index, there's no number written right here as my index, but it's always at 2 if it's not written. That's even. That means I'm going to have a positive or negative answer, which you could include your answer like this, plus or minus 4, which is the same thing as saying x equals a positive 4 or a negative 4. Both of those would be the correct answer for this problem. B, going through this problem, you can see the exact same thing here. So I could say, okay, that's x times x equals negative 36. But I notice here if I do the square root, this is an even index, and I don't have any number that I can times by itself that will ever give me a negative when it's an even index. So as a result of that, this problem is not possible. There's no solution. And just a side note for those of you that need to see it, this one does have a 2 there. It's not written, but we have a 2 there. That's why it's an even index. Our next problem, the first step we need to do here is we need to isolate the variable. And to do that, we notice here's our variable x. There's a number next to it. I need to get rid of that. So I need to think to myself, what's happening to x? That is 4 times x, and since that's 4 times x, I need to undo multiplication. So what's the opposite of multiplication? And you guys should be thinking, oh, opposite of multiplication, that would be not subtraction. It is actually division. So isolating this variable, I go through here and I say, okay, I have 4 times x squared, I need to divide by 4. Whatever I do to one side of the equal sign, I need to do to the other side of the equal sign. So that gives me now x squared equals 20. These two are equivalent equations. And then again, from our previous step, we noticed, oh, it's x squared, so I would use the square root. Whatever I do to one side, I need to do the other side of the equal sign. And then I would get a final answer, x equals the square root of 20. And it's going to be plus or minus because it's an even index. And you could do 4 point whatever square root of 20 is. Looks like it's going to be a 4.472 something. But I'm going to just leave it as square root of 20 because it's not a whole number, it's not an integer. So I'll just leave it that way. D, looks like we have a little bit to do. What would be our first step here? What would you want to do? And we're thinking backwards here, so I have 3 times x minus 5. If I divide by 3, that means I'm going to have to divide 3 here as well, so I don't want to do that first. The very first step I would look at when isolating x, I want to do order of operations backwards. So I'm going to do subtraction first, which means I need to get rid of that by addition. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. And then I go through and I get negative, or 3x squared equals 27. From here, again, isolating this variable, this is multiplication, so I need to use division. So I go through, divide 3 by both sides, and I get x squared equals a 9. And again, this is squared, so it's an even number. That means I have the square root. And I'm going to use plus or minus here. It's going to be a positive 3 and a negative 3 for the correct answer. Our second to last slide, going through this one, we're going to go with cubes now, and we need to find the value of x in each equation, just like before. But it's not a square anymore, it's a cube, and so with the cube we have to use a certain function. The way I could think of this is what number times itself 3 times, so x times x times x equals 27. Well, to show this one, I would go through and I could figure out some number, or I could use the math function, the cube root, which is taking this number and I take the cube root, which notice there's a 3 as in the index. That's an odd number, so we know that whatever the sign is, that's what it's going to stay. The sign here is positive, it's going to stay positive. And I take this and say, okay, I'm going to go through, do the cube root on the other side, and I get x equals, oh, and a side note for those of you that may have forgotten, to get the cube root symbol, you have to hit math 4 on your calculator, math 4. And so we get x equals a positive 3. Looking at b, I notice that x cubed equals negative 8. This is a negative, so my answer is going to be a negative because it's an odd power. And I go through there, that means the index is going to be odd, so I take the cube root, so notice an odd index, and I take the cube root, which will give me x equals a negative 2. Our last slide for today, we have C and D. It looks like we have a couple steps that we need to solve through here, but it's with the cube root again. How do I isolate this variable? How do I get x by itself? Well, I look, what's happening? What's 7x mean? And if you haven't recognized, you should notice that's multiplication. So I take that and I say, okay, opposite of multiplication, I isolate this by doing division. Whatever I do to one side of the equal sign, there's my equal sign, I need to do to the other. And as a result of that, I get x cubed equals 64. And then I take the cube root. And the index is odd, so that means I keep the same sign, which is positive. So I do the cube root, which means x equals a positive 4. D looks pretty difficult. Looks like we have a lot of stuff to do here, but let's take it a step at a time. Order of operations backwards. If I go through here, the very last thing to happen would be plus 6, so that's going to be the first step to isolate x. I take that plus 6 to undo plus 6. The opposite of addition is subtraction, so I subtract 6. Whatever I do to one side of the equal sign, I need to do to the other, so I subtract 6, and then I get a negative 5x cubed equals 500. Opposite of multiplication, I do division. Whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. And those two cancel. The same number divided by itself is 1. So I'm left with x cubed equals negative 100. This is a cube, so I do the cube root. And the cube root, that's a odd index, so that means we keep the sign. But with this one, if I take the cube root of 100, it's going to be a decimal. So I'm just going to leave my answer as x equals the cube root of negative 100. That should help you out for today's assignment. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, hope you have a great day.